Hi, I'm Micah. Thanks for watching my video. I assume if you're watching this, you're probably interested in the practical certificate in OSINT that I'm running from 6 to 9 June of this year. So I wanted to give you a little teaser around the course, give you a sense for what the content's going to look like, what the course, how the course is going to run, and a little bit about me, just so you get used to the idea of having to stare at my face for 4 days. Great. Okay, so let's jump in. The thing that excites me the most about open source intelligence is that it lets anybody think like an intelligence analyst. We've all seen the movies, we've seen all these cool guys doing all the cool stuff. The great thing about open source intelligence is that you can actually do a lot of that work. You can be that intelligence analyst, but you can use open sources to do it. And that, in a lot of ways, is the part of open source that excites me. I've been working in this field for about a decade as an analyst and as a manager and as a tool developer and now as a product director and a trainer and teacher. But ultimately, the thing that excites me the most is the thinking that goes on, both as in open source, but in intelligence in general. So a lot of the class is going to focus on analytical thinking in the context of open source intelligence. So what does it mean to be an intelligence analyst? Someone a long time ago coined the idea of being a ninja librarian, right? This kind of like very sleuthy, very, very focused, very, very intense person who's incredibly good at finding information and making sense of that information. So I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. But the reality is, intelligence work is really hard. What makes intelligence so hard? Well, Hutchins, others have said a variety of things. And again, I'm both a practitioner and an academic, so I kind of get to do both. And so you'll see a lot of papers throughout the presentation. First of all, intelligence work is just learning fundamentally. I've come to realize that over time. It's just learning. Secondly, there's a ton of knowledge management involved, figuring out what you've learned, organizing it in a reasonable way to be able to then develop reasoning out of that and come to meaningful judgments, and then ultimately curate all of that stuff, put it together, and produce it. That's not easy to do. Any of you who've ever written a paper have gone through that experience too. It's a lot of what intelligence feels like. And for open source, it's especially difficult, partly because it's happening under remarkable time pressure. There's a huge amount of source synthesis happening, drawing together all these things, a lot of uncertainty about the world and the situation that's happening around, a huge mental workload, massive risk aversion within organizations, especially for OSINT, data overload, big time, inadequate tools, and then the one right underneath my little picture there, organizational pressures. Often organizational pressures around open source intelligence are huge because people don't necessarily understand how open source intelligence works. And actually, that's the first big problem that we need to tackle in the class. So fundamentally, the beginning of the class is really about learning to trust your struggle and trust the reality that intelligence work is really hard. But the good news is there is hope. Now, Hype Canyon is a thing that I start with pretty much every single class that I run. I explain to people that there's a canyon. This is actually a canyon close to where I grew up in Colorado. And on one side of that canyon is what open source intelligence can actually do. On the other side of that canyon is what your consumer, the person who's reading your intelligence work, thinks it can do. And getting across that gap is where all the problems happen. It's where all the fun happens too, but it's where all the problems and questionable intelligence activities and mistakes and frankly privacy problems, all of those things generally happen in trying to get from what we can actually do to what people think we can do. And the trick then is to ground yourselves really, really firmly on the reality of what open source intelligence can do so you can start building that bridge across to your consumer. So that's a big, big part of what we'll be doing. Part of what makes open source intelligence so difficult is that it's so omnipresent. So a funny joke from back in the day, David Foster Wallace, a writer from the 90s, uses this joke sometimes. Two fish swimming along through the sea and wandering along, and another fish comes swimming the other way and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish keep swimming, and one of them looks at the other one and says, "What the hell is water?" And that's part of the problem, right? We don't even notice open source intelligence. We don't even notice all the open sources that are out there because they are so omnipresent. And in some ways, it is the water, right? It's everywhere. It fits into every little crevice between all the other intelligence disciplines in a lot of ways. But there's also these vast oceans of publicly available information that you can use, and just getting your head wrapped around that can often be quite difficult. The constant availability of it actually means that people often undervalue open source intelligence because it's not so hard to get. It's just water after all. The reality is water can kill you. water's a big deal. So anyway, keep that in mind. It's a way of thinking about it, and again, cognitively useful. Another really important distinction to think about in that context is between open source intelligence, which is the output of your work, and the work itself, the process and the discipline. But it's actually using something publicly available information. So distinguishing between the material, the publicly available information, and the intelligence is a really useful distinction to make. I spent a lot of years working with the U.S. military and intelligence community. The early years, OSINT was just OSINT, and it was all of these things. It was the information, it was the work, it was the output, it was all jumbled together. And they made an important distinction some years ago between the information and the actual work. So information is just information. Intelligence is a result of a process, and that process is actually an important thing for us to learn. I think collection discipline is a great phrase to learn the distinction. So we're going to talk about both. We're going to talk about PAI, we're going to talk about OSINT, and we're going to talk about why that distinction matters so much. OSINT itself as a craft, I would argue, has a significant sustainability problem. I would even say a sustainability crisis. And we'll talk a lot about this and how that actually works. But there's three sort of levels for now that I would mention. One, organizationally. Most organizations, particularly in the government, have not figured out how to use open source intelligence effectively. So their efforts are really sporadic and really bizarre a lot of the time. Certainly not something that can be sustained over time and make it a thoroughgoing part of the work. Secondly, methodologically. Again, it's like water, it's everywhere. And so figuring out how methodologically, how do I tackle this? Most of the open source information out there, or publicly available information, is on the internet. The thing about the internet is that it's built to be experienced, right? If you go on the internet, it's just like comes at you. That's not what you need to do with intelligence. You need to be able to analyze. You need to be able to look at it in a particular way. So methodologically, that can be quite challenging. And then ultimately underlying that is that cognitive experience. And figuring out how all the little subtle things that are going on in your mind, how those affect the work that you're actually doing. Making your thought processes and your methods more sustainable helps to make it more sustainable for your organization as well. So, an important distinction, another one here, between investigation and intelligence. So often the things that most people see talked about as OSINT are actually open source investigations. They're not necessarily open source intelligence. What does that mean? Well, first of all, investigative work is inherently very technique driven, very focused, and usually the outcome of an investigation is evidence. It's a specific thing that you can point to, a smoking gun, and say, hey, that's the thing. I went, I did the really hard work to find it, I did the brilliant, clever things that I needed to do in order to arrive at this very, very clear outcome. And again, ideally, evidence itself is self-evident. You can actually see it. By contrast, intelligence often isn't that clear cut. We may have evidence. We don't really necessarily think of it as evidence. We really think of it as intelligence, which is designed to inform a decision. It's designed to inform the judgment of someone who needs to make a high consequence decision or do a difficult thing. I've never played golf, but it looks pretty difficult. And so that distinction is really important too. The things that you need to bring to evidence are often really good clarity in terms of what you did, how you arrived at that sort of process, but then ultimately the outcome is just the evidence. With intelligence, you need to do all of those things as well, but then you also need to make a meaningful assessment of a very highly uncertain situation. And that, I think, is actually where some of the beauty and the art of this world comes in. So, for example, Bellingcat, which is a widely known and very, very impressive open source shop, they don't call themselves open source intelligence people. Lots of other people might. But if you look at their website, you talk to them, you read their book, they don't think about themselves as open source intelligence people. They think about them as open source investigators. It's a really important distinction. And you start to look around, you notice it. So they talk really specifically about geolocating things. Firm, done. Proving something, firm, done. That's an investigative outcome. But by contrast, if you look, for example, the UK MOD has been putting out assessments of the Ukraine conflict, you start to see something very different. You start to see things like highly likely, can be expected, probably. Right? These are assessments and judgments. And that's really that fundamental distinction that we have to get at. A big part of intelligence work is coming to a probabilistic judgment about a situation. In fact, that's often how we talk about them. This is from way back in the day, back in the 90s. Words of estimative probability. This is a concept of how do we describe the likelihood of something happening in that context. So all the best practices that we can get from the intelligence world and bring to the open source world can be really, really handy here. And that's a big part of what we'll do as well. All right, again, another way of thinking about this: puzzles, mysteries, and complexity. So people love solving puzzles, right? Investigations are puzzles often. We see people doing Sudokus all the time because it's really satisfying. You get to the end of it, and man, you finish it. It's done. It's a beautiful feeling. But usually, the outcome is the evidence, right? Mysteries, on the other hand, which is more what intelligence often looks like, mysteries are more probabilistic. It's probably more likely than not, this is the most likely outcome, or however you might phrase it. And so that there's some sort of more art to it. And it's kind of beautiful. Complexities, whole other thing. We'll talk about that during the course, whole other level, and definitely relevant to open source intelligence. But again, this is from the academic literature. This is Greg Treverton, who's both an academic and an intelligence practitioner in the United States, talks about these three different categories of sort of problems. And the internet only makes all this stuff worse, by the way. Keeping that in mind, that as I said, the internet is designed to be experienced, not to be analyzed. And so a big part of it, and we all experience this in our day-to-day lives, is being productive when you're doing intelligence work because you have to interact with the internet. To sum it up nicely, this is me trying to handle more than one thing at a time. That happens all the time. So switching costs and a lot of issues related to kind of cognitive load are super, super critical. I'm really into cognitive issues, as you can probably tell, and a lot of my design work in terms of my technology development and building open source intelligence tools is really specifically focused on building tools that work the way that an analyst thinks, because it's just so difficult to begin with. Okay, but there is hope, and this is where we really talk about what actually the course is going to start looking like. First of all, the first one, we're going to focus a lot on planning. First part of the class, you got to know what you're going to try to do before you can actually go and do it. A lot of people just jump in, it doesn't go well. Second, strategic search. Most open source stuff involves a fair amount of searching with search engines and other interfaces. Those interfaces tend to have a weird effect on how you actually think about your problem. And so being really strategic in how you actually do the searches is an important skill. I have a thing called the 3 Cs that I think is a really, really handy thing that you can transfer to almost any tool. And then thirdly, reasoning and decision making. I've found stuff, or I found an initial lead. Where is that going to take me? Which direction do I go with this? How do I approach it? What sort of biases do I need to think about? Things like this. We're going to spend a fair amount of time doing that. And then fourthly, functional literacy. We're going to cover some things that you just kind of need to know about, some phrases, some concepts, some important ideas that will help to inform and fill out your open source sort of skill set, if you will. And this is sort of one of those things that gives you superpowers when you're doing open source work, and that can also really impress your friends at barbecues when you can talk to them about heuristics and things like this, and shibboleths and all sorts of other fun little ideas that we'll come up with. So those are sort of the 4 key areas of work that we're going to develop. First of all, first day is going to be foundation and context. This is kind of how the course develops. Foundations and context, a lot of stuff, some of the stuff that you're seeing today, but a lot more stuff as well. Second, skills and methods. Third, we're going to talk a lot about sustainability, that sustainability crisis that I mentioned. There's a solution. I think we can get there, but it's a long haul, and there's a lot of things that you can do as an individual and then do it with your organization to make that sustainability problem, ease. Second part of that actually is automation and using tools. Tools are really tricky. I've spent most of my career building these tools. There's good, bad, and otherwise, but no matter what, those tools tend to exercise an influence on how you do your work. So figuring out how to evaluate the tool, what does it do? How does it use my data? Is it secure? Is it efficient? Is it explainable? All of these things. I'll give you some frameworks that you can work with, and then we'll actually go out. Each of us will go out onto the internet and go find a few tools from a list that I'll provide and use that evaluation framework to actually do a kind of a workup on one of those tools. So that's a lot of fun. I should mention there's lots of other practical applications throughout the course. That's just the one I thought of. And then the fourth one, the last day, is basically focused on application. How do I actually use all this stuff to make beneficial things in the world? And then integration. How do I integrate the work that I'm doing with other people that are maybe doing similar work, or with other people who are doing different types of intelligence work within a larger construct? That's where the magic happens in a lot of ways. Open source is such a critical tool that fits within and between a lot of other intelligence forms. And we'll get into that. You'll learn all sorts of interesting things about all the other intelligence disciplines as well that will benefit your thinking around open source. Okay, but really, fundamentally, the prime objective of this whole thing, I like to think about it as being MacGyver. The thing about MacGyver is it's not that he was ever expert with any one tool. It was that he was expert with whatever tool he encountered. When he walked into a situation, he could use a paperclip and the other thing and the other whatever to solve his situation and solve this problem and get out of it. It's pretty miraculous. And I tend to think that MacGyvering your way through open source is a nice way of thinking about it. I don't want to just train you on resources. There's lots of other courses and online materials that are just replete with lots and lots of resources. I don't want to do that for you. You can go do that yourself. It's really not that hard. What I want to give you is resourcefulness. I want to give you the sensibility that you might need to then take that and run with it, and be able to solve really any problem with any tools that you can find in order to get the job done. Okay, so who am I anyway? Good question. Here's all the places I've worked. I've worked a lot of different places. I've spent basically the last 10 years doing open source intelligence in one capacity or another. Initially as like a data monkey and analyst, worked my way up, ended up managing teams of analysts, which is fascinating. And in that context, realized that a lot of the tools that were available to us were not fit for purpose or just didn't do what we needed them to do. Started building tools and started selling those tools to important people in government and things like this. And over the years, that's just kind of continued. At one point, I was helping to provide tools, evaluate them, train them, and integrate them for really important sort of special operations units in the United States and Canada and elsewhere. And so I've got a lot of experience with open source intelligence in really high consequence environments. That's really what I'm most interested in. But along with doing that, I also teach intelligence at Carleton University here in Ottawa. And I teach intelligence and international affairs. So the course, as you can tell, is a bit of a balance between very practical stuff and a bit more academic stuff, but I actually think that there's a lot of magic there. I should also mention, I got a dog. This is my dog, Saskia. She's adorable, and you're going to get to see lots of pictures of my dog, Saskia. So if that's what you're into, why not? Come on. Join me. You can get to hang out with Saskia. Maybe she'll even make a cameo appearance. You never know. All right, so there you go. Practical certificate in OSINT, 6 to 9 June 2023, coming right up, maybe a couple weeks out now. We're going to run it from 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern, which is a kind of a sweet spot. So it's the evening in Europe, and it's the kind of earlier in the day for the West Coast of the United States and Canada. So it's kind of a best of both worlds situation. The thing is entirely online. I'm really experienced running engaging online classes. So it's going to be a lot of fun. But there's a cap of 20 students. We're getting very close to the cap. So please do sign up soon if you're interested. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to me on whatever mechanism you might be able to, email or LinkedIn or whatever. And I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. Thanks.